The coronet arrived at 7 in the morning, wrapped in a cloth that had once been white, carried by the underfootman with the expression of a man who had drawn the shortest straw in the servants' hall. Dorothea Vane received it in the doorway of her dressing room, still in her wrapper, her hair not yet dressed, and she understood in the space of a single breath that the whole of Fernhallow Park had been watching to see what she would do. It was the Countess of Strelford's coronet. Specifically, it was the coronet that had rested on the head of the previous Countess of Strelford at every formal occasion for 22 years, a piece of antiquated silver gilt that had been left quite deliberately in the back of the Blue Room's cedar chest while the new Countess's dressing room went furnished, and servants' assignments were made, and precedence was arranged at every meal. Left there, she was beginning to understand, as a kind of waiting insult, to see how long it would take her to notice. She took the coronet from the cloth. It was heavier than it looked. She placed it on her head, adjusted it once, looked at her own reflection in the pier glass beside the dressing-room door, and said to no one in particular, "It fits." By midday, word had reached the Dower House. That had been 3 months ago. On this particular morning, the morning the Countess of Strelford was expected to receive the assembly of local families at Fernhallow's midsummer gathering, Dorothea stood before the same glass and settled the same coronet into the dressed loops of her dark hair, and she did not permit herself to think about what the room below would cost her to walk into. She had worn the thing to spite them. She was beginning to understand that spite alone had never been the point. The winter that produced Dorothea Vane had been a lean one, not in the ledger sense, though the ledgers had not been cheerful, but in the way that a household understands the mood of its patriarch. Her father, Sir Edmund Vane of Hartwick in Northamptonshire, had kept 3 daughters and no sons, a fact that he treated as a personal slight delivered by Providence, and he had organized his estate accordingly, which is to say he had left it in a condition that would force the eldest daughter into the most advantageous marriage she could manage before his own death ended whatever social credit his name still carried. Dorothea was the eldest. She had known this since she was 12. She had been presented in the season of 1812, at the age of 19, in a gown that had been cut down from her mother's second-best dress, the pale cream silk still lovely despite its age, and she had stood at the edge of 2 successive ballrooms and watched other girls be collected by men whose interest she could not afford to interest, and she had been practical about it. She had danced when she was asked. She had made the correct conversation. She had not pretended she had more than she had, nor pretended she wanted less. At the ball, given by Lord and Lady Cheshire at the close of the season's second week, she had been introduced to James Carlyle, the Earl of Strelford. The introduction had come from her hostess, who had arranged it with an expression that suggested she was doing someone a charitable service, though Dorothea had never been entirely certain for whom. Lord Strelford had been 31 and recently bereft of his wife of 4 years, a fact that the season had designated both interesting and dangerous, the way a storm is interesting when it is happening to another county. He was tall, with the kind of face that required a second look to make sense of. Broad-boned and difficult. The jaw too set. The brow too level. The eyes so dark a gray they registered as black in candlelight. He had looked at her across the introduction as though she were a document. He was deciding whether to read. He had not asked her to dance that evening. He had come to call 3 days later, which was irregular, and left his card, which was not. And when she had been brought down to the morning room, he had sat across from her for 17 minutes in a conversation that she understood to be about neither the weather nor the park, but about whether she was, in some particular sense he had not named aloud, capable. She had not been certain of her answers, of. She had given them, anyway. He had proposed before the week was out. It was not a romantic proposal. It was a precise one, and she had respected the precision and she had accepted, and they had been married in October. She had arrived at Fernhallow Park as its new countess in the last week of October, and by the first week of November she had understood 3 things. The house was very old and very large, and in greater disrepair than his correspondence had suggested. The previous countess, the first wife, had been beloved there in a way that occupied every hallway like furniture. And James Carlyle, the Earl of Strelford, did not know how to speak to her. Not would not. Could not. There was a difference, and she had learned it by watching him. He was not cruel. That had been the first surprise. She had arrived armored for coldness and found instead a man who gave orders precisely and kept distance, and whose eyes, in the rare moments when she caught them resting on her, held something she was not yet equipped to interpret. He managed his estate with a thoroughness that bordered on severity. He ate his meals in near silence, not because he had nothing to say, but because speech, for him, appeared to require more permission than most rooms granted. The household had been waiting to see what she would make of him. The household, she had quickly learned, was also waiting to see what the Dowager Countess would make of her. If you have ever wondered about this story, or watched someone wear a thing they were not supposed to have simply because no one gave them permission to set it down, stay with it a little longer. What Dorothea did next was not simple, and it did not come cheap. Lady Aldith Carlyle, the Dowager Countess of Strelford, occupied the dower house at the far end of Fernhallow's long drive, and she had occupied it for precisely 3 years, since her son's first marriage had necessitated the move that propriety required. But she had never, in any practical sense, removed herself from the running of the house. She arrived for breakfast twice a week. She had opinions about the menus. She supervised the linen in ways that the housekeeper, Mrs. Birtle, navigated with the careful diplomacy of a woman walking a narrow path above a cold river. She was not unkind in the obvious fashion. She was, instead, correct. She was perfectly correct in a way that contained within its perfection a very precise record of everything Dorothea was not. She had a manner of allowing silence to fall at exactly the moment it would land hardest, of completing a sentence about the late Countess in a tone that was neither comparison nor insult, but only description, as though she were simply noting what a room once contained before the furniture was changed. At the first dinner with the local families, Lady Aldith had introduced Dorothea to the gathered company as James's second arrangement. Not wife, not countess. Arrangement. The room had not corrected her. Dorothea had smiled because there was no other option and had passed the syllabub. By December, the household had settled into its positions around the fault line the 2 women represented. Mrs. Birtle was loyal to the house and therefore to whoever ran it with the most practical authority, which was currently not Dorothea. The under-footman, Thomas, was loyal to whoever was kind to him, which was Dorothea, though he was careful not to let this be obvious. Agnes Roper, who served as Lady Aldith's personal attendant and had done so for 11 years, was loyal to the Dowager Countess with a ferocity that made her eyes small and watchful whenever Dorothea passed her in the corridor. And then there was Nora. Nora Carlyle was 7 years old, and the daughter of Lord Strelford's late wife, and she had been managed since her mother's death the previous year by a succession of governesses who had not quite managed her, and she occupied a set of rooms in the East Wing with the quiet intensity of a person who has decided that the world is probably not to be trusted, but is willing to be demonstrated wrong on specific points of evidence. Dorothea had found her in the library on the 3rd morning of December, reading a book she was too young for, sitting cross-legged on the floor behind the largest chair, in a position that said she had been there for some time, and had chosen that spot specifically Because no one would look. I will not tell you to sit properly, Dorothea had said, because I frequently sit that way myself and find it superior. Nora had looked up from the book and assessed her with gray eyes that were unmistakably her father's. Mrs. Birtle says you are not supposed to be in here. Mrs. Birtle is incorrect, Dorothea had said pleasantly. I am the Countess. The library belongs to the house, and the house belongs to my husband, and therefore the library is exactly where I am supposed to be. She had sat down on the floor herself, at a respectable distance, and had said, "What are you reading?" Nora had held up the book. It was a natural history of birds, which was well beyond her reading level, and which she was working through with visible stubbornness. Dorothea had said, "I can help with the long words, if you like." Nora had considered this for a very long moment. Then she had said, "All right." James Carlyle had been standing in the library doorway for some minutes. Neither of them had noticed him. He had looked at his daughter's face. That particular quality of attention she gave to very few things, offered without reservation to the new Countess on a library floor. And he had turned and walked away without announcing himself. And for a long time afterwards, he had stood in the corridor outside with his hand resting on the wall as though needing it for support. And the thing moving across his face was not readable from a distance. But it was real. This was the witnessing. He had not planned for it. He had not planned for any of it. What Dorothea did not know, and what Lord Strelford had told no one precisely, was that his first wife's death had been prefaced by 6 months in which he had misread her unhappiness as complaint. He had managed it rather than addressed it. He had been competent and present and wrong in the specific way that a man is wrong when he treats grief as a problem to be solved rather than a weight to be carried together. And when she had died of the fever that came in the late spring, he had understood in the aftermath that his management of her sorrow had been a form of abandonment, wearing the clothes of duty. He had resolved, in the long winter after, not to do it again. The resolution had arrived without telling him what it was to be replaced by. He had proposed to Dorothea Vane because she was practical and clear-eyed and did not perform emotions she did not feel, and because Nora needed someone capable, and because his solicitor had suggested it was time, and he had told himself these were sufficient reasons and had not inquired too closely into the others. The others were there. He had simply decided not to read them. Lady Aldith had her own reading of the situation, which was that the new Countess was a temporary inconvenience whose evident capability would not survive its first serious test. And she had arranged that test with the patience of a woman who has managed a great house for 30 years and understands that the right pressure applied at the right moment will reveal what a person is made of. She had arranged for the midsummer gathering. It was Fernhallow's oldest social occasion, the assembly of the county's prominent families, hosted by the Countess of Strelford every year without exception. Lady Aldith had hosted it for the 22 years of her tenure. The previous Countess had hosted it once in her second year and had done it graciously, and this year it fell, as it must, to Dorothea, who had never organized an event of this size in her life, whose social credit was borrowed and thin, and whose authority in the household had not yet solidified enough to command the cooperation she required. Lady Aldith had offered to assist. "Of course," she had said at breakfast in February, her tone the temperature of early spring water, "it will be a great deal for you to manage alone in your first year, without experience of the county's particular customs. I am happy to lend my guidance." Dorothea had accepted the guidance with the kind of gratitude that costs something. She had then, very quietly, spent the next 4 months doing the work herself. She had consulted Mrs. Birtle about the customs, and Mrs. Birtle, who had maintained the household through 2 countesses and recognized which wind was blowing, had begun to respond with something approaching directness. She had written to the families herself, in her capacity as countess, in letters whose tone she calibrated with care. She had managed the menus. She had arranged the music. She had spoken with the groundsman about the kitchen garden terrace, which had been let go during the winter and required considerable work. And she had done it without consulting Lady Aldith on the grounds that the grounds were the countess's to consult. She had made mistakes. Some of the invitation lists were wrong in ways she did not discover until too late. One family had been omitted by error that required a separate personal note of apology. The flowers she had planned arrived on the wrong morning and required an hour's reorganization that left her hands shaking and her composure thin. Lord Strelford had found her in the lower parlor at 9:30 in the morning, on the day before the event, surrounded by displaced arrangements of meadow sweet and late roses, and she had been reorganizing them herself because the footman detailed to assist had been sent on another errand by someone whose instruction took precedence. He had looked at the room. He had looked at her. "Come inside," he said. "I am inside," she said, which was technically true. He crossed the room and removed the stems from her hands with a directness that was almost startling. "Sit down." "I cannot sit down. There are 47 things I need to attend to before tomorrow morning." 47, he said. "You have counted them." "I always count things that need attending to." Something moved across his face then that she had seen before and could not name. He set the flowers on the table with a care that was slightly at odds with the decisive way he had taken them. "The arrangement of flowers is not among the 47 things," he said. "That is what Thomas is for. I will speak to Thomas." "Someone had already spoken to Thomas," she said. A pause. "Then I will speak to the person who spoke to Thomas." She looked at him. "You know who that was?" "Yes," he said. "I do." He stood there, a foot away, and she was acutely aware of the distance, and aware that she was aware of it, which was not comfortable. His hands, she noticed, had not quite returned to neutral after setting the flowers down. They rested at his sides with a deliberateness that suggested they had been told to stay there. "You have managed this without help," he said. It was not, precisely, a question. "I have managed it with the help available to me." That is a distinction. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the light shifted as a cloud crossed the sun, and the lower parlor went from gold to gray. And she watched the change move across the line of his jaw, and thought, not for the first time, that he was very difficult to look at, and very difficult not to. She had been thinking that since October. It was inconvenient and persistent, and she had managed it the same way she managed everything, by keeping her attention on the work in front of her. The work had been considerable. The work had been, if she was being precise about it, the reason she had survived the winter without arriving at conclusions she was not certain she could afford. His hands were still. She noticed that they were still in the particular way of a man who has given them the instruction to remain at his sides and is checking that they are obeying. She noticed this because she had spent 8 months noticing what his hands did, in the absence of other information about what he felt, because his hands were frequently more legible than his face. "You have not asked me for assistance," he said. "I was told this was mine to manage." "You were told by my mother that it would be difficult to manage alone." A pause. "That is not the same instruction." She met his eyes. They were doing the thing they did sometimes, that thing she had not yet put a name to, where they held still in a way that was not blankness but its opposite. "Lord Strelford," she said. "James," he said. It landed like a thing set down carefully in a quiet room. She did not say it back. She was not yet ready. She heard the offering of it, and she did not refuse it. And he saw that she did not refuse it, and for a moment, nothing else in the room was particularly important. "I will manage tomorrow," she said. "I only need to not be impeded." "Then you will not be impeded," he said, and he left to find Thomas. The day of the gathering came with the particular cruelty of good weather, which offered no excuse for anything. The county's families arrived by carriage along the long drive between 11 in the morning and 12:30. There were 43 of them, a number that Dorothea had memorized along with their family connections and the order in which precedence required them to be received, and she stood at the entrance to the principal rooms and received them with a composure she had rehearsed in the dressing-room mirror at 6 that morning, while the coronet sat on the stand behind her. She had put it on at the last moment. Not for them, for herself. It was Lady Aldith who arrived last of the principal guests, a timing that was not accidental, and who said to the 3 women of her particular acquaintance gathered near the entrance hall, saying, "She has worn the coronet to the gathering. I confess I had wondered if she would know to." A breath of a pause. One does wonder, with these new arrangements, what has and has not been explained. The 3 women received this in the manner it was intended. Dorothea, who was 6 feet away, heard it. She had developed an acute ear for the texture of rooms since November. She served the next guest with the correct attention, and did not look at Lady Aldith, and the thing she felt was not humiliation, but something quieter, a kind of settling, as though the remark had finally finished a sentence that had been running since October, and she could now see the whole of what it said. The morning progressed. Dorothea had arranged the gathering into 3 parts. First, a reception in the main rooms. Then a tour of the kitchen garden terrace for those families who had expressed interest in the restoration work underway. And finally, a midday meal taken in the long dining room. She moved between them with the measured attention she had given to every other task of the spring, and if she was aware of being watched, she was also aware that being watched was simply a condition of the position, not an argument against holding it. Mrs. Pemberton, who was 71, and had known Lord Strelford's mother and his grandmother before her, stopped Dorothea near the terrace door to compliment the kitchen garden arrangement with a specificity that was unmistakably genuine. "You have restored the old herb plot," she said, and her voice carried a warmth that said the old herb plot had history. "It wanted attention," Dorothea said. "It seemed a pity to leave it." "The late Countess," said Mrs. Pemberton, and then stopped, and adjusted the direction of the sentence before completing it. "The previous late Countess, that is. She had plans for it. I am glad someone has seen them through." Dorothea understood she was being told something. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. At 12:30, during the transition to the dining room, Lord Neville Crane made his way to where Lady Aldith was standing near the principal window, and said in the carrying undertone of a man who had once been a colonel and still managed volume accordingly, "She has rather well in hand, your daughter-in-law. You must be pleased." Lady Aldith's expression adjusted with the precision of long practice. "Dorothea is adequate," she said. "Given time, she may develop something like polish." Lord Neville, who was 70 and owed his bluntness to age, said, "I would call it rather more than adequate, Aldith." Lady Aldith smiled in the way that said the matter was closed. It was not closed. Dorothea was in the dining room, managing the seating, when Lord Strelford appeared at the doorway and stood there for a moment, simply watching. He watched her direct the footman, watched her redirect a seating error without drawing attention to it, watched her speak briefly and privately to the eldest daughter of the Roper family, who had arrived looking unwell, and arrange for a quiet word with the housekeeper. And he watched the girl's shoulders settle with visible relief a few minutes later. He was aware of a number of things simultaneously. He was aware of the particular quality of his mother's attendance today, her position near the window, her movements through the room that consistently intercepted Dorothea's path without quite obstructing it. He was aware of the gathering's general disposition, which had moved across the morning. From the careful neutrality of families assessing a new countess to something more like warmth, unforced and specific, directed at the woman now standing at the far end of the dining room table, consulting the placement cards with a focus that required she tuck one strand of dark hair back from her face and lean over the table in a posture that was entirely unself-conscious and entirely absorbed. She was not performing competence. She possessed it. He had watched her acquire it all spring, against resistance he had not adequately opposed, and the weight of that sat across his chest with the steadiness of something that had been there for some time and had simply been waiting for the right moment to become legible. He had provided, he understood now, a house, a title, and a set of responsibilities that his mother had then spent 8 months working quietly against. He had managed the situation. He had been very present, in the particular way of a man who is occupying a space without quite inhabiting it. And he had not asked Dorothea Vane once, in 8 months, whether the house was yet her home. She had made it her home anyway, through sheer particular costly attention. Through 47 numbered things, and a letter of apology to a family accidentally omitted, and a herb plot restored in April, because it seemed a pity to leave it. He stood in the doorway a moment longer than was necessary. He had watched her acquire it all spring, against resistance he had not adequately opposed, and the weight of that failure sat across his chest like a creditor waiting in the hall. He thought of the library in December, and Nora cross-legged on the floor with a natural history she could not quite read, and the new countess sitting beside her on the floorboards in her good morning gown, and the way his daughter had held the spine of the book up for inspection without first checking to see whether it would be worth the offer. Nora had not done that since her mother died. He had managed his first wife's unhappiness. He had been very present and very wrong, and she had died before he understood that distinction. And he had organized everything afterwards into duty because duty did not require him to examine the room where he had failed. The portrait had been in his study for 2 years, turned slightly to the wall by his own hand. Not hidden, but not quite visible. The way a man keeps something that causes pain without quite being able to remove it from the room. Nora had her mother's chin, though not her coloring. He knew this because he looked at his daughter and made the accounting every time. He had kept the accounting because it felt like the least he could do. He had thought, when he proposed to Dorothea Vane, that he was being practical and measured and correct. He had told himself that Nora needed someone capable, which was true. He had told himself that the house needed managing, which was also true. He had been very careful not to examine what else he had told himself late in the winter evenings before the decision was made, when he had sat in the study with the portrait just out of his line of sight and thought about a young woman who had accepted his proposal without pretense, who had looked at him across 17 minutes of careful conversation and given him honest answers with the composure of someone who had not expected anything to be easy. He had offered Dorothea his name and his house, and had not, until very recently, offered anything else. He crossed the room. The conversation in the dining room continued around them. He came to stand beside her at the head of the table, close enough that she registered his arrival with the slight adjustment of posture that she always made in his proximity, the one he had been cataloging since November, without permitting himself to say why. "The placement is correct," he said quietly. "I know," she said. "I was checking." "Yes." He stood there. "You have done well today." She turned to look at him. and her expression was one he recognized from the lower parlor, the one that assessed precisely what a remark contained, and decided in a single moment whether to accept it at face. "Thank you," she said. "It was not easy." "No, I am aware of that." She looked at him with a steadiness he had not quite earned. "I do not need you to say it was difficult. I need the household to understand whose authority they answer to." "Yes," he said. "I intend to make that plain." Something in her face shifted then. Not softened. Something more complicated than that. She had been prepared, he understood, for adequate. She had not been prepared for this. The meal began. Lord Strelford sat at the head of the table. Dorothea sat at his right. Lady Aldith was positioned 3 seats down, which was where propriety required her to be, and which she accepted with a grace that cost her something, though it was calibrated so as not to show. The meal went well. During the course of it, Miss Elowen Penrose, the eldest daughter of a baronet and a woman Lady Aldith had been careful to keep in her vicinity throughout the morning, said to the table at large of the restored herb terrace, "I had not thought it would come to so much. A governess's daughter managing a restoration of this scale. Well," she left the sentence there, a small glittering thing, and looked toward Lady Aldith for confirmation. Lady Aldith said nothing. It was Lord Strelford who spoke. He set down his glass and said, in the level, carrying way he had, the way that did not require volume because it did not require performance. "My wife is the Countess of Strelford, Miss Penrose. This is her house." The silence that followed was not long. It was complete. Miss Penrose went slightly pink and addressed her plate. Lady Aldith looked at the table in front of her with an expression that required considerable internal management. Mrs. Pemberton, 4 seats down, made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. Lord Strelford picked up his glass again. Dorothea looked at him. He looked back at her. In the silence his eyes had made, she saw it clearly for the first time. The thing she had not been able to name since November. The quality of his attention when he thought she could not see it. And she understood with the sudden certainty of a thing long suspected, finally proven that it was not observation. It was regard. It had been regard all along. The meal continued. Afterwards, when the last carriage had gone down the drive, and the long rooms were cooling, and the footmen were clearing the last of the arrangements, Dorothea sat in the library in the hour before dinner, not reading, her hands folded in her lap, the coronet on the stand beside the desk. Nora came and sat in the chair across from her with the natural history of birds, which she was still working through at considerable determination. "Did it go well?" Nora asked, without looking up. "I believe so," Dorothea said. "Mrs. Birtle says it went very well," Nora said. "She said you managed quite impressively." "Mrs. Birtle is generous?" "She is not, usually." Nora turned a page. "That is why I told you." Dorothea looked at the girl's face, bent over the book, and thought, not for the first time, that she was her father's daughter and her mother's daughter both, and that being in the room with her was one of the specific pleasures Fernhallow had produced. Lord Strelford came to the library at the last of the light. Nora received his arrival with her customary directness. "Papa," she said, "Dorothea thinks Mrs. Birtle was being generous, but I told her that Mrs. Birtle is not usually generous." "She is not," he said. He looked at Dorothea. "Mrs. Birtle told me in nearly identical terms." "Then I am satisfied," Dorothea said. He crossed the room with his habitual deliberateness and sat in the chair nearest the window, at an angle that was not quite toward her and not quite away. Nora had returned to the birds. The evening light came through the long windows and lay across the room in bars of gold and dust. They stayed there for a time, the 3 of them, in the particular quiet that belongs to rooms where something has been decided without being spoken. Dorothea looked at the stand where the coronet rested. She had worn it to spite them. That had been true. It was also true that she had spent the months since learning what it required, learning the weight of it, learning every room it meant she was responsible for, and the morning room she had reorganized at 9:30 while her hands shook, and the letter she had written to the family she had accidentally omitted, and the natural history of birds read on a library floor in December, and the moment in the lower parlor when she had not said his name, but had not refused the offer of it either. She had worn the crown to spite them. She had proved it was hers through every single one of those days. "Dorothea," Lord Strelford said. She turned. He was looking at her in the evening light, directly, the way he had not permitted himself since November. And his face had arrived, finally, at the expression she had seen it approaching for months. The one that did not require management or suppression or careful distance. The one that was simply what he felt when he looked at her. "I spoke today, as I should have spoken in November," he said. "I regret the delay." She looked at him. She did not make it easy, because it had not been easy. But she did not make it harder than it needed to be either. "We are here now," she said. He nodded, once, slowly, as though she had given him something he had not been certain she would give. Nora turned a page with great attention and said nothing, which was how she demonstrated that she was, in fact, listening to everything. That evening, after Nora was seen to bed, Lord Strelford stood in the doorway of the principal sitting room where Dorothea was going over the last of the accounts from the day, and he said, without particular ceremony, "I find I would like to sit with you a while, if that is not unwelcome." She moved the accounts to one side. "It is not unwelcome." He sat. The fire had been built up against the cooling of the evening. Outside, the long drive was still in the summer dark, the kitchen garden terrace invisible beyond the lawn, the herb plot she had restored in April going quietly to seed in the way of late June, already looking as though it had always been there. The room was comfortable in a way it had not been in October. She had done that too, though she had never drawn attention to it. A chair repositioned, a footstool returned from the east wing where it had been misplaced. The arrangement of candles adjusted on the mantelpiece so the light fell better in the evening hours. Small things. Nothing that required comment. She had simply looked at the room and seen how it could be easier, and made it easier, and left no evidence that anything had been changed except that it had. She had done this to the whole house. He had been watching it happen for 8 months, and had said nothing, because he had not known what to say, and because the part of him that managed things had concluded that the house's improvement was satisfactory, without requiring him to examine why the particular person who had produced it made the improvement feel like more than management. He looked at her now, sitting across from him with the accounts put to one side, her hands folded quietly in her lap, the firelight moving across the dark curve of her hair. And he felt something in the region of his chest that was not duty and was not management, and had been there, he suspected, for considerably longer than he had given it permission to be. He said, after a long, comfortable silence that neither of them seemed to feel the need to fill, "My mother will adjust." "I know," Dorothea said. "She is not unkind. She is simply incorrect." He looked at her with the nearest thing to warmth she had seen on his face since October. "That is a precise formulation. I have had some time to arrive at it." "Yes." He was quiet again. Then he said, "Nora said last week that you have finished the natural history of birds, that you went through it twice." "The plates in the second half are excellent," Dorothea said. "We were reading them for the pictures." He looked at the fire. When he looked back at her, something in the set of his face had changed. The jaw no longer quite so held, the line of his brow released from whatever private discipline had organized it. It was a different face than the one the season had seen, or the household, or even, until very recently, herself. "I am glad you are here," he said. "I should have said so a great deal earlier." She met his eyes, and he did not look away, and she did not either. "You are saying so now," she said. He reached across the space between them and set his hand over hers, where it rested on the arm of the chair, and the warmth of it moved through her, like something finally answered. And neither of them said anything else for some time, because there was nothing else that needed to be said. The fire settled. The summer dark held the windows. Somewhere in the east wing, if she listened, she might hear Nora still awake, still reading, still working through some large and patient book by the light she had been allowed to keep. The coronet sat in the dressing room upstairs. She had worn it to spite them, and she had proved it was hers. And now it was simply where it belonged, and she had found, in the proving of it, a great deal more than she had set out to claim. If her journey to this room moved you at all, leave a word in the quiet, and stay for the next one. There are more stories worth the telling. The kitchen garden terrace in that first summer of its restoration was the most beautiful it had been in years. Mrs. Birtle said so. Nora said so. Mrs. Pemberton wrote a note to say so, and received a reply in Dorothea's hand, in the tone of a woman who had learned to inhabit her title without apology. Lord Strelford said nothing about it specifically. He came to the terrace in the late afternoon of the first week of July, where Dorothea was inspecting the herb plot with the particular satisfaction of a person who has done a difficult thing well, and he stood beside her in the long golden light, and he said, eventually, "It looks as it should." "It does," she said. He offered his arm. She took it. They walked the length of the terrace together, at the measured pace of people who are not in a hurry, because there was nowhere they needed to be. And the evening was warm, and Fernhallow spread around them in the English light, very large and very old and, at last, simply theirs.